Names that echo through history: Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, Yale, Harvard. Their legacies are common knowledge, but the dark foundation of their wealth is a secret they all shared. A fortune built by inundating China with a devastating narcotic. The scale is staggering. Thousands of tons unleashed. Millions ensnared in addiction. Profits soaring to 400%. A 200-year conspiracy of silence followed, meticulously crafted to bury the truth. But that silence is about to be broken. Consider Franklin Delano Roosevelt, an icon etched into Mount Rushmore, the celebrated savior of a nation in crisis. The chilling reality is that his family's immense wealth originated from the trafficking of a potent substance, opium. The human cost was catastrophic. Millions consumed by addiction. Millions perishing. Yet, from this devastation, the Roosevelt dynasty amassed an obscene fortune. And they were not the only ones. The Astors, once America's wealthiest clan, owed their riches to the same illicit trade. The very name Forbes, a symbol of financial journalism, was built upon the profits of this narcotic enterprise. Yale's secretive Skull and Bones Society was financed by traffickers. Even the hallowed halls of Harvard were constructed with silver tainted by the China trade. We are examining the cornerstones of American power, the very institutions designed to shape our leaders, the dynastic bloodlines that continue to wield influence over this nation to this day. Their entire empire was erected on a foundation of chemical dependency, forced upon China at an industrial scale. We're analyzing thousands of tons, with profit margins reaching an astronomical 400%. What followed was a systematic erasure of this history, a deliberate rewriting of the official record. They laundered their blood money through philanthropy, constructing libraries and museums to sanitize their legacy, ensuring generations would remain ignorant. That calculated silence ends now. The proof has survived. The shipping manifests still exist. The personal letters were never destroyed. The financial ledgers, long dormant in dusty archives, are now being examined, and their contents unveil a disturbing truth about America's so-called aristocracy. The very families we have been conditioned to revere. They amassed their fortunes through activities for which we incarcerate ordinary citizens today. The critical difference lies in the scale. Their operation targeted an entire nation, poisoning millions and systematically dismantling the Chinese economy. They accumulated a level of wealth so vast it could purchase silence, effectively deleting their crimes from the annals of history. This is the forbidden narrative, the chronicle of how narcotics traffickers ascended to the status of American royalty and concealed their ascent for 2 centuries. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is recorded as the 32nd president, the commander-in-chief who navigated America through the Great Depression and the Second World War. His likeness is carved into a mountain, placed among the pantheon of Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. He is presented as an American hero, but the official curriculum omits a crucial, damning part of his story. The immense fortune that financed his privileged youth, his Harvard education, and his very entry into the political arena, it all stemmed from the profits of illicit substances. The architect of this wealth was his grandfather, Warren Delano II. He amassed millions by trafficking opium into China, a trade that precipitated a crisis of addiction for millions of Chinese citizens and resulted in countless deaths. From this human tragedy, the Delano family accrued unimaginable wealth, and their story is not unique. The Astors, who held the title of America's wealthiest family in the 1800s, built their empire on these same narcotics. The Forbes clan, yes, the founders of the financial media giant, erected their publishing dynasty upon the very same profits. An examination of Yale University's benefactors reveals the Perkins family, whose funding was derived from the opium trade. The Cabots, pillars of the Boston Brahmin elite, were also deeply enmeshed as narcotics traffickers. The Russell family, the very founders of Yale's Skull and Bones, were themselves opium smugglers. A pattern emerges. Some of the most powerful, respected, and influential dynasties in the nation's history constructed their fortunes by peddling addiction. This was not mere participation, it was market domination. By the 1830s, American firms had seized control of a staggering 10% of the entire opium pipeline into China. The metrics are grim. Tons of raw narcotic, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and an entire Chinese generation systematically devastated by addiction. Meanwhile, American families accrued such immense wealth that they could endow prestigious universities. They established museums and forged political dynasties whose influence persists to this very day. This is the suppressed chapter of American history. It is a chronicle of how America's elite accumulated their foundational wealth in the opium trade, how they systematically sanitized that history, and how these very same families then spearheaded a century-long campaign to criminalize these substances for the masses. The sheer hypocrisy of this arrangement is staggering, and the evidence supporting it is irrefutable. Before we dissect the specific family legacies, it is critical to understand the true nature of the opium trade. We must move beyond the sanitized, museum-curated narrative and confront the grim reality. In the early 1800s, the British Empire faced a significant economic imbalance, importing vast quantities of tea, silk, and porcelain from China. The problem was, China had no demand for British goods. Consequently, Britain was hemorrhaging silver, critically depleting its national reserves. They urgently required a commodity to reverse this trade deficit, a product the Chinese population would consume on a massive scale. They found their solution: opium, cultivated in British-controlled India. It was then refined into a potent, smokable form and covertly trafficked into China, where its importation was strictly forbidden. The Chinese government had already outlawed opium, fully aware of its destructive, poisonous nature. But this prohibition was of no concern to British and American merchants. The profit margins were astronomical, reaching 400, even 500%. An investment of $100 for opium in India could be smuggled into China and sold for $500 or even $600. The risks were lethal. Chinese authorities summarily executed any trafficker they captured, but the potential profits were deemed worth the ultimate price. And American dynasties were eager to enter the fray, possessing a crucial advantage. Their ships were faster than their British counterparts. These were the clipper ships, engineered for pure velocity. They were the perfect instrument for evading Chinese naval patrols and delivering their illicit cargo to clandestine locations along the coast. The mechanism was deceptively simple. American captains would voyage to British India, procure thousands of pounds of opium, then sail to the Chinese coast and lie in wait at designated offshore anchorages. From the shadows of the coast, Chinese smugglers would emerge in small vessels, exchanging silver for the cargo of addiction. The American ships, critically, never technically breached Chinese ports. This was the architecture of plausible deniability. And the silver, a river of it, flowed back to America. This dark exchange persisted for decades, from the 1800s to the 1840s, just before the Opium Wars erupted. But the trade didn't stop. It intensified, ensnaring millions of Chinese citizens in a web of dependency. China's economy was systematically drained, its silver hemorrhaging into the coffers of Britain and America. And in America, a new aristocracy was rising, using this blood money to construct legitimate empires. We must now dissect who they were. To pull their names from the sanitized pages of history, let us begin with the most famous. The Delanos, the family of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Warren Delano II, born in 1809 in Massachusetts, was dispatched to China at the tender age of 19 to work for a trading company. By the time he was just 24, he had become a partner in Russell & Company, the undisputed titan of the American opium trade in China. This was not mere participation in the opium trade. They engineered the American involvement. They maintained offices in Canton, Guangzhou, commanded a fleet of swift clipper ships, and forged critical links with British opium producers in India. The profits were staggering. Warren Delano himself directed this vast smuggling network from 1833 to 1846. 13 years spent orchestrating the flow of a nation's affliction. He then returned to America. He returned a man of immense, almost unimaginable wealth. But how wealthy? Wealthy enough to construct a 40-room mansion in Newburgh, New York? Wealthy enough to secure his children's places in the most elite schools? So wealthy, in fact, that when the financial panic of 1857 threatened his fortune, he simply returned to China, resumed his trade in opium, and came back even more powerful than before. It was his daughter Sarah Delano who married James Roosevelt. Their son was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The world FDR was born into, one of private tutors, Harvard, and political dynasties, was entirely underwritten by this opium money. But here is the chilling paradox. In 1935, while serving as president, this same Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the first federal laws to aggressively control certain substances. This legislation, a precursor to the Marijuana Tax Act, represented a major expansion of narcotic controls. The very man whose family empire was built by profiting from the addiction of Chinese people now presided over the criminalization of drugs for Americans. The hypocrisy is suffocating. Now our analysis must turn to another dynasty, the Astors. John Jacob Astor, who at one point was the wealthiest man in America. His fortune erected the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, endowed libraries, and forged a dynasty that endures to this day. But from where did this colossal wealth truly originate? The official narrative points to furs. While true, the fur trade was merely a facade for the real engine of his wealth, opium. John Jacob Astor's ships began their voyages to China in 1800. His vessel, the Macedonian, was a key player in the opium circuit. Astor's strategy was not a simple exchange of furs for Chinese goods. He trafficked Turkish opium for Chinese silver, and only then used that silver to acquire furs, tea, and silk. The opium route was the critical, hyper-profitable artery that fueled the entire enterprise. By 1840, Astor's net worth was $20 million, the equivalent of $500 million in today's currency. The vast majority of it was derived directly from opium profits. His great-grandson, another John Jacob Astor, would perish on the Titanic, remembered as one of the planet's richest men. That legacy was founded on a trade of human misery. The Astor name is now etched onto libraries, museums, and university halls. All of it, every brick, financed by drug money extracted from China. Now, consider the Forbes family. Yes, that Forbes, the very same family of Malcolm Forbes, the billionaire magazine publisher. Their dynastic wealth was also born in the China trade. The Forbes clan of Boston began sending ships to China in the early 1800s. The brothers Robert Bennett Forbes and John Murray Forbes were central figures in the opium trade. They were deeply enmeshed with Russell & Company, the very same firm that employed Warren Delano. Robert Forbes personally captained the clipper ships that ferried the poison. His brother, John Forbes, funneled the profits into railroads, becoming one of Boston's most powerful men. It was this wealth that their descendants leveraged to launch Forbes magazine. The family ascended to the status of American aristocracy, a status built entirely on a foundation of opium. In Boston, John Murray Forbes is memorialized as a pioneering businessman and a great philanthropist. You will find statues of him, buildings bearing his name. But the source of his fortune, the opium, is never mentioned. It has been meticulously scrubbed from the official record. The pattern repeats with the Perkins family, specifically Thomas Handaside Perkins, known in Boston society as T.H. Perkins. He stood as one of New England's richest men in the 1800s, his name attached to hospitals, asylums, and schools. The critical question remains, how did he acquire this fortune? The answer, once again, is opium. Perkins was a founding partner of Perkins & Company, an entity that would later merge into the opium behemoth Russell & Company. For decades, he orchestrated the movement of opium from Turkey and India into China, accumulating millions. He then retired to Boston, where he was reborn as a revered philanthropist. Even Yale University's Perkins Fellowship, named for his family, is a direct product of this opium money. Consider the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, a monument built on opium profits. Thomas Perkins is lionized as a great man, yet the tainted source of his fortune is a carefully buried footnote, if it's ever mentioned at all. Then we unearth the Russell family. In 1823, Samuel Russell founded Russell and Company, an enterprise that would become the most dominant American opium firm operating in China. Russell accumulated a staggering fortune and then simply retired. He retired to Connecticut, where in 1832 his cousin William Huntington Russell would co-found the infamous Skull and Bones Society at Yale University, a secret order known only as Skull and Bones. This is the shadowy fraternity that has yielded presidents, Supreme Court justices, and directors of the Central Intelligence Agency. George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, John Kerry, all of them bonesmen. The very foundation of the Russell family fortune, the capital that established Yale's most powerful secret society, was derived directly from the sale of opium. That same money was funneled into the Russell Trust, an entity that continues to finance the operations of Skull and Bones to this day. Let the analysis be clear. The most powerful secret society in America was constructed with Chinese opium money. Now, let us examine the Cabot family. The Boston Brahmins, the very definition of old money, of respectability. Their immense wealth was generated through trade with China in the early 1800s, and the principal commodity of that trade? It was, predictably, opium. The Cabot family name is etched into the very fabric of Boston. Cabot House at Harvard, streets bearing their name. Yet, the opium connection is systematically, deliberately erased, and the pattern continues with the Low family, specifically Abiel, another prominent opium merchant who ran clipper ships to China, amassing millions. His son, Seth Low, would ascend to the presidency of Columbia University and the office of mayor of New York City. The family then donated a portion of this fortune to construct the Low Memorial Library at Columbia. Once again, opium money builds an Ivy League institution. The pattern is undeniable. The methodology was consistent. American families journeyed to China in the early 1800s. They either joined existing opium syndicates or established their own. They accumulated vast fortunes from the illicit trade and then returned to America. This capital was then laundered through investments in railroads, real estate, and other legitimate enterprises. They purchased respectability. They endowed universities, museums, libraries, and hospitals with their tainted wealth. The final step was to meticulously erase the opium connection from their family chronicles. Their descendants were thus transformed into an American aristocracy, and a conspiracy of silence descended upon the true origins of their power. We are not analyzing a small-scale operation. By the 1830s, American firms controlled approximately 10% of the total volume of opium flooding into China. While British firms dominated the market, the American share was significant. Americans were indeed significant players. Russell and Company, operating alone, shipped thousands of chests of opium on an annual basis. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of raw narcotic. Thousands upon thousands of pounds of opium, year after relentless year. The scale was nothing short of industrial, and the profits were astronomical. A single successful opium voyage could generate a return of 400 to 500%. Ship captains and company owners became millionaires overnight. In the currency of the 1830s, this translates to the wealth of a multimillionaire, or even a billionaire by today's standards. And this insidious trade persisted for decades. Even after the Opium Wars, conflicts China waged for the explicit purpose of halting this poison, American firms continued their smuggling operations. They simply became more adept at concealing their activities. Now, we must confront the devastation this opium inflicted upon China. By the 1830s, an estimated 10 to 12 million Chinese people were ensnared by addiction. This constituted roughly 10% of the entire adult male population. The addiction became so pervasive that it crippled the Chinese economy, hemorrhaging the nation's silver reserves to pay foreign traffickers. The Chinese government made a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. They appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu with a mandate to eradicate the trade. In 1839, Lynn confiscated and incinerated 1,000 tons of British-owned opium in Canton. The British response was immediate and catastrophic. War. The First Opium War, waged from 1839 to 1842, ended with a decisive British victory, compelling China to sign the humiliating Treaty of Nanking. Under its terms, China was forced to pay crippling reparations, open its ports to British commerce, and cede the territory of Hong Kong. The treaty cleverly avoided explicitly legalizing opium, but it rendered any enforcement against it impossible. The trade, therefore, exploded. American firms, meanwhile, benefited enormously. With their British competitors preoccupied by the war, American syndicates like Russell and Company simply absorbed their market share. In the aftermath of the war, both British and American opium smuggling resumed, but now at even more staggering levels. This inevitably led to the Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860, a conflict ignited for precisely the same reason. China once again attempted to halt the trade. This time, Britain and France waged war, finally forcing China to formally legalize opium and open still more ports to foreign powers. And through it all, American firms once again profited immensely, both during and after the war. But the human cost in China was a catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. Millions were addicted, families were obliterated, and the national economy was left in ruins. Yet in Boston, New York, and Connecticut, those same American families were erecting mansions and founding universities. But the most infuriating dimension of this analysis is yet to come. The very same families that amassed their fortunes by pushing opium then pivoted, spearheading the movement to criminalize these substances for everyone else in the early 1900s. America positioned itself as the leader of the international movement to ban opium. The Hague Opium Convention of 1912, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, the United States became the global architect of drug prohibition. What was the real impetus? By that point, the American elite had already secured their fortunes, and the influx of Chinese immigrants meant opium dens were beginning to appear in American cities. These powerful figures had no intention of allowing competition, terrified that American laborers might succumb to the same devastating addiction that had ensnared the Chinese workforce. And under no circumstances could the source of their own vast wealth, the very same substance trade, be exposed. The inevitable solution was to legislate it into criminality. They systematically branded opium users as deviants and criminals, all while meticulously burying the historical record of their own families' mass distribution of that drug to China. Consider Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose own grandfather amassed millions from this very trade. He would go on to sign some of the most stringent anti-drug legislation in American history. Thus, the dynasties built on narcotics spent the 20th century relentlessly prosecuting and incarcerating others for drug-related offenses. The sheer scale of the hypocrisy is staggering. But the truly insidious part is this: the entire history has been systematically sanitized. The average American remains completely unaware that the Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Russell, and Cabot dynasties all built their foundational wealth on the opium trade. One need only visit the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library for proof. There, the Delano family's connection to opium is relegated to a single minor exhibit, euphemistically dismissed as mere trade with China. Examine the Astor family's historical accounts. The word opium is scarcely found. Their narrative is carefully constructed around furs and real estate. Turn to the Forbes family history. It speaks of railroads and magazines, but a deafening silence surrounds opium. Yale University acknowledges Samuel Russell as a generous benefactor, but the opium enterprise that financed his generosity is conspicuously absent. At Harvard, Cabot House stands named for the Cabot family, yet their role in the opium trade is nowhere to be found in the official chronicles. This erasure of history was not accidental. It was systematic and meticulously executed. These families leveraged their immense wealth and influence to literally rewrite the past. They made colossal donations to universities with the explicit condition that inconvenient facts be omitted. They seized control of the historical narrative through powerful foundations and endowments, ensuring their own descendants would remain ignorant of the true, dark origins of their family's fortune. Yet, the evidence is irrefutable. It exists in shipping manifests, personal letters, detailed account ledgers, and within historical archives across China, Britain, and the United States. Researchers have painstakingly documented this reality. Books have been published. The Delano Influence by Daniel W. Delano. When America First Met China by Eric J. Dolan. The Opium Clippers by Basil Lubbock. Yankee Traders, Old Coasters, and African Middlemen by George E. Brooks, Jr. The proof is all there, but it is deliberately excluded from school curricula. It is absent from museum exhibits. The average American is left in the dark, which is precisely how these families intend to keep it. The reason is simple. If the public understood the truth, the meticulously crafted reputations of these dynasties would shatter. It would provoke deeply unsettling questions. If the Delano family's wealth was built upon a substance that devastated millions of Chinese lives, how can we reconcile the heroic image of Franklin Delano Roosevelt? If the Forbes dynasty was founded on the poisoning of China, on what grounds do we celebrate Malcolm Forbes? If Yale's notorious Skull and Bone Society was financed by opium profits, what does that reveal about the very foundations of America's elite institutions? The cognitive dissonance would be unbearable for the national psyche, and so, the truth remains interred. Now, consider the parallel they desperately want you to ignore. During the 1980s and 1990s, the Central Intelligence Agency was implicated in facilitating the flow of cocaine into America's inner cities, a scheme to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. The resulting crack epidemic decimated black communities. When that story finally surfaced, it triggered outrage, official investigations, and reluctant admissions. Gary Webb, the journalist who broke the story, was professionally annihilated, but the truth was out. The public understood that their own government had permitted drugs to ravage communities for geopolitical advantage. Now, we must apply this exact same analytical framework to the 1800s. Elite American families intentionally saturated China with opium for immense profit. The consequence? Millions of Chinese lives were obliterated, and the nation's economy was left in ruins. And those very families then channeled that blood money into building the bedrock American institutions that command respect today. Where is the outrage? Where is the historical reckoning? Where is the accountability? There is none, because the dynasties responsible became so monumentally wealthy and powerful that they gained the ability to rewrite history itself. They could ensure their foundational crimes were simply erased from memory, and they could guarantee their descendants would live in opulent luxury, forever shielded from the horrific truth of their ancestors' actions. Let us be perfectly clear about the scale of this operation. Conservative financial analyses indicate that American firms extracted between $50 to $100 million from the China opium trade between 1800 and 1860. That is 50 to 100 million in 19th century currency. When adjusted for inflation, that figure equates to a staggering 1.5 to 3 billion in today's dollars. And that number represents only the profits. The total value of the narcotic itself was exponentially higher. This was never small-time smuggling. This was state-of-the-art industrial-scale narcotics trafficking, complete with fleets of ships, warehouses, networks of agents, systemic bribery, and a fully integrated logistical operation. The American operations involved a vast network, thousands of personnel, Chinese intermediaries, maritime crews, Canton-based agents, and Boston-based financiers. It was, by any objective measure, a colossal and meticulously organized criminal syndicate. Yet within America's borders, this was not deemed a crime. It was simply business. The architects of this devastation were not condemned. They were lauded as pioneering merchants and titans of industry. To grasp the sheer magnitude of this, consider a modern parallel. Envision a cabal of today's American billionaires orchestrating a cartel, deliberately inundating Mexico with a substance like fentanyl. The fallout would be catastrophic. Millions of Mexican citizens ensnared in addiction, hundreds of thousands dead. And then, picture these billionaires sanitizing their profits by endowing Harvard. They would funnel money into political campaigns and erect museums in their own honor. Now, project forward 150 years and find their direct descendants occupying the offices of presidents, senators, and university chancellors. And the origin of this foundational wealth? A topic shrouded in deliberate silence. This isn't a hypothetical. This is the precise legacy of the opium dynasties. And we are the inheritors of the world they constructed. We are implicitly forbidden from asking the critical questions. But we must remember that in China, the opium wars are not a forgotten footnote. They are a defining element of national identity, known as the Century of Humiliation. This was the era when Western powers systematically imposed opium upon China, dismembering the nation for their own gain. This history is ingrained in every student, taught in every school. Every citizen of China understands that Britain and America deliberately poisoned their nation for financial gain. They know this act precipitated colonization, devastating wars, and the deaths of millions. Yet here in America, this history is simply not taught. The vast majority of Americans would be unable to articulate the basic facts of the opium wars. They are almost certainly unaware that foundational American fortunes were built upon it, and it is a near certainty they do not know that these same families continue to wield immense wealth and power to this day. The disparity in historical memory is nothing short of staggering. China meticulously remembers and educates its people on the injustices inflicted upon them. America actively forgets and sanitizes its role as the perpetrator, and the dynasties that profited are content with this manufactured ignorance. The critical question, then, is what must be done with this revelation? First, the unvarnished truth must be brought into the light. The Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Russell, Kitt, and Lowe families amassed their foundational wealth through the mass distribution of opium in China. The direct consequence was the addiction and death of millions of Chinese people. Their economy was shattered, while these American families accumulated enough capital to establish dynastic power. Second, we must confront the profound hypocrisy. The very lineages that built their fortunes on the narcotics trade later championed the criminalization of those same substances for the general populace. They leveraged their immense wealth to enforce prohibition, all while meticulously concealing their own history as narcotics traffickers. Third, we are compelled to scrutinize the very institutions founded upon this wealth. Yale, Harvard, Columbia, the Great Museum, our hospitals, our foundations, all of them financed at least in part by the proceeds of the opium trade. Is it not time they acknowledged this origin? Is the question of reparations not a valid one? Should the families who continue to benefit from this legacy be held to account? These are deeply unsettling questions, yet they must be posed, because right now, these dynasties remain dangerously powerful. The Delanos, the Forbeses, the Russells, the Kitts, they remain integral to America's ruling elite. They continue to command wealth and influence that flows directly from the profits of Chinese opium, and for this, they have never faced a reckoning. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's own family fortune was built upon the sale of narcotics to China. The Astor Empire was erected on a foundation of opium. The existence of Forbes magazine is a direct result of opium profits. The Skull and Bones Society was financed by opium money. Harvard, Yale, and Columbia all have structures paid for with the proceeds of this trade. This is not the realm of conspiracy theory. This is meticulously documented history. The proof resides in archives, in personal letters, in shipping manifests, and in financial ledgers. Researchers have substantiated these claims beyond any doubt. Volumes have been written on the subject, yet the average American remains ignorant, because this narrative has been systematically buried. It has been sanitized and surgically removed from the official historical record. And the beneficiary families have a vested interest in your ignorance. Because if you were to understand the truth, you would be forced to conclude that some of the most powerful, most revered, and most influential dynasties in American history are the direct descendants of narcotics traffickers, and that the revered institutions they constructed, the universities, the foundations, the political dynasties, were all capitalized by the systematic poisoning of millions of Chinese citizens. The reality is grotesque, but it is the reality, and the time for public awareness is now. If this revelation has altered your perception of American history, subscribe, for there are countless other narratives just like this one. More truths that have been deliberately interred, more falsehoods that demand to be unearthed. The opium dynasties have evaded accountability for 200 years, but the truth possesses a persistence that time cannot extinguish, and I will continue to excavate it.